Welcome to Moral Footprint, the podcast where we unlearn, rethink, and take action. I'm your host, Jeni Miles, and together we'll challenge the systems we've inherited, confront the crises of our time, and most importantly, explore the strategies and support networks that help us move from awareness into meaningful change. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by philosopher and author Alexis Shotwell, whose work has been instrumental in helping us navigate our complicity with harmful systems. In her groundbreaking book, Against Purity, Alexis explores how we can acknowledge our entanglement in systems of harm without becoming paralyzed by guilt or perfectionism. We'll discuss why trying to be ethically pure is ultimately pointless, how we can transform feelings of shame into collective action, and why small intentional choices matter even when they won't single-handedly solve systemic problems. Alexis offers a refreshing perspective on moving beyond individualized guilt towards meaningful solidarity and collective change. So if you've ever felt overwhelmed by the enormity of global challenges or unsure how to live ethically in an imperfect world, this conversation is for you. Let's dive in.
Alexis, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's really such an honor to have you so we can discuss your work and your writing. I was just saying before we hit record how much your work has really been a guide for me in figuring out how we deal with our position and living in complicity with harmful systems that we're all caught up in. And I wanted to start with a quote from your book, Against Purity. You're essentially saying how there's no way we can eat, shop, consume energy or live without being tangled up in suffering. And you say, what happens if we start from there? What I love about that quote is it's really talking about the fact that we can't be perfect. Trying to be ethically pure is pointless, and starting from there is a great place to figure out your journey in living in a better way. So perhaps you can talk to me about why is harm unavoidable from your work, and how do we then navigate that paradox?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's wonderful to be here, and I'm excited for the work that you're doing, and really great
Thank
to be
you.
part of the mix and part of the conversation. And yeah, exactly. I think that when I was working on this book, and I've continued really thinking about this all the time, one of the things that prompts me or that animated the book is really this insight that people of goodwill and good heart are almost the ones who are most likely to be shut down in realizing that they would like to live otherwise, they would like the world to be otherwise. And then as soon as they actually, or we start working with that, it very quickly becomes just completely overwhelming. And so I think that feeling of overwhelm is so understandable. It's so accurate. It's just so true, right? There is too much for any individual person to do. And it's very, very logical when we start from the view that we should personally be able to solve these enormous problems. It makes so much sense that we come to a realization that we cannot personally solve any of the many overwhelming problems that we face. So both just sort of tactically, but also as a matter of kind of fact, I think it's better for us to start from the understanding, the feltness that we're not alone. We can't do it all ourselves, but that feeling implicated, feeling complicit is actually a good place to start instead of a reason to stop.
Mm-hmm. I was actively trying to live a more vegan lifestyle. So I was caring a lot about what type of food I was eating and almost like creating these rules for myself of, I have a leather handbag. Oh no, I shouldn't own a leather handbag anymore. I should get rid of it. I just kept this sort of mental gymnastics about what I could and couldn't do. What your work is saying is that there is that paradox, and we're all in this profoundly unethical world and see the systems that are set up in an unjust way. So once we do start from there, how do you think we can practice like an alternative way?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is to make this conceptual shift, to recognize that feeling that our personal lifestyle decisions should solve things, that this is a historically produced view of ourselves that serves the existing system. In some cases, it's been explicitly set up, and it's not like someone like tented their fingers and was like, I'm going to make people feel bad about themselves. But there is actually pretty good evidence that, for example, petroleum companies, oil and gas companies are responsible for arguing that we should think about our personal individual carbon footprint rather than looking at things like military spending, factory, production, all of these things, or that things like campaigns around litter were a pretty explicit way for corporations to turn our attention away from regulatory bodies saying enormous companies shouldn't pollute waterways to saying you need to pick up trash. It's your fault that the world is. So one thing is just to sort of notice when that individual thing is coming up and redirect it, right?
Yeah, because, exactly. With BP, they created the carbon footprint concept, didn't they?
Yeah.
And it was all about just make sure that you turn your light off as you leave a room.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to quickly dig into the military piece as well as part of this, because I only learnt about 2 years ago that if we just look at carbon, which is just one aspect of harm that our systems cause, the emissions of military is so astronomically more than even a lot of the companies. We're then worrying about flying to see a friend or, we're thinking about what we're eating. But what you're saying is there's so much more at a system level that we've deliberately been distracted from.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the things that can happen then is that people say, and I have a number of friends who say this, look, it's not individual lifestyle decisions, which is absolutely true, that make the world the way that it is. And therefore, we should just do whatever. So we shouldn't think about it at all. And in my experience, people of good conscience aren't comfortable with this either, that you can do this, but at a certain point, and, I think we often think about the ecology piece of it, but I really think we could look at this in any vector where we feel that sense of care or that sense of, I'm involved in that, right? So I live in Canada now, but I'm originally from the US. I really am thinking a lot about people being deported in brutal conditions because they are undocumented. And I think this is definitely a concern in Canada too. So anything that I look at, I can feel like, it is my tax dollars that are paying for, these people to be incarcerated on, right? Like, so there's these places where we say, and I don't want to say just because it's too big and it's too wicked a problem, right? So we think about these as wicked problems where we're all involved. Anyone that, anything we try to do is going to make certain things worse. It's complicated. And we could just throw up our hands. I call this the fuck it reaction. Like, okay, I'm just gonna...
My actions don't matter anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll take as many flights as I feel like and can afford. I'll eat as much, single serving yogurt, like whatever the thing. So the first is to recognize like, that was a trick. But the second is this much more complicated thing, which I think is where you're interested in, which is how do we actually start from the places that we're implicated and take that as traction rather than shutting down?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so for me, there's two parts of this. One is the way that we attend to our life and the existential dimension of this. And the second is the collective work that we can do out of the places in which we recognize our implication. The existential stuff is interesting in this realm.
Yeah.
I have come to really see, I grew up in a Buddhist family. I'm currently not practicing because of abuse scandals in my community, which are very complicated, and we can talk more about it. Everything is related, right? But in the community that I grew up in, one of the things that I do think animates how I am oriented toward these things is a conception or a practice of everyday life as a form of ceremony. So that the way that we live shows something, manifests something about the way that we live. So that who we are and how we are is part of a practice of becoming the kinds of beings who can transform the world, who can be transformed by it. And so even though we know that recycling is not going to solve anything, I feel that there is something that organizes our subjectivity when we do what we can in the space that we're in. So this is, I think, it's a beautiful existential imperative. And this does come in this work that I've been doing, writing this book about Ursula K. Le Guin, and we can talk more about her science fictional work. She really is someone who is forwarding, manifesting a really kind of intense existential demand to take responsibility for the choices we can make. Mm-hmm. What's interesting about this is that when we approach our daily life, the minutiae, the smallest part of our life with a quality of attention, we begin to have a sense that what we're doing is among the choices we have, among the options we have, we're choosing deliberately. And I think that there's something that changes this feeling of immobilization where you say, and it moves, right? So what we can do at any given time is going to be different. So there will be times when there's a lot of capacity to make your own bread and sauerkraut and hummus and
Grow your own veg. Yeah.
Have a garden, all of these things. And there's going to be times where it's not possible, or your children will the only thing that they're eating is those like single serving, vegetable, fruit, slurry packs in plastic and if the whole idea of what we're doing is just to be like, you're bad for serving your child that instead of this completely misses
it's kind of ignoring then the context that you're in, isn't it? And what I'm hearing from what you're saying is that we all have values that are very dear to us. We believe ourselves to be good people, and there are people, especially like you and I think like me, who have been trying to grapple with these questions, and they're like so overwhelming. But then when you realize there's a dissonance between your values and how you act, what I actually really find quite valuable from what you're saying is just trying to embody your values on a small scale it does matter. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to overthrow the industrial, white supremacist complex, but it is going to help you show up in a certain way. And I think also that's what we need, isn't it? We need to feel like we matter in some form rather than just step away and look away from these harms that we're inadvertently causing as a society.
Yeah, because the only place that we're building meaning is in our actual life. Mm-hmm. And the only place that we're building our capacity to have power is in our own self, our own subjectivity. So when we're making those choices and when we're doing things deliberately, in a kind of clear-eyed way, one of the things it does is it builds our kind of existential resilience to do what we can where we are with what we have. And so that what we can, that ebbs and flows, right? So if we're sick or our kids are having a hard time, or what we can do, our capacity is going to change. The situation we're in is going to be morphing and shifting. The time that we're encountering is going to... So this is really important, because if we say that the only people who are going to count as ethical or like kind of moral saints are people who can eat organic, make their own bread, hummus, sauerkraut,
who
etc.,
happen to have the privilege to pay for what we would call ethical consumption choices, that's not being truly ethical at all.
No. And it means that we're saying only rich people are going to be ethical.
Yes.
So we clearly, we know that many rich people are not even doing that, right? Someone was just telling me the joke that Taylor Swift has to take a private jet to get from one end of her private jet to the other end of her private jet. No disrespect to Taylor Swift. But, it's really this quality of like, we don't want only the rich to be ethical. It's manifestly not the case.
Yes.
So just individually approaching everything that we care for to the degree we can with the kind of intense like integrity we can bring to it is part of this orientation. And I think on the individual level, the other thing that I talk and write about a lot is the idea that what we're opposing is systems of domination. And we should include in that opposition exercising domination over ourselves. So
I love that.
Being a person who is just constantly vicious to ourselves, it's actually part of what we're trying to
we're perpetuating exactly what we're trying to move away from. Yeah.
So, and I think it matters not even just sort of notionally or in a ceremonial way or existentially. I think it actually does matter that people do live their life in a way that they contingently, as much as they can stand behind. And
something I just wanted to dig into there, because we talked about, carbon footprints. It's very individualistic, isn't it? Of I can consume in a better way, or I can consume less, therefore I'm a better person. And I think that's why with the podcast name that I've kind of come up with several years ago, Moral Footprint, it gets to what you're saying about it's not just what we do in terms of the emissions, it's actually thinking about it more broadly about what we do does have impact on other beings, on nature. And I think also carbon footprints, it's all about measuring, isn't it? It's a very like rational, I'm going to tell you you're 88% ethical, when I don't think you can measure anything like that. It's not a quality that can be measured.
No, but it is transmissible. And so I'm writing a short book right now with philosopher and sort of eco-artist Kilian Jorg that we're calling An Ecology of Morals. And we begin this book with this feeling that we're calling the throb, which is a feeling when you're with people or you're seen and there's something that's really profoundly out of whack between what they say about what they're committed to and what they're doing. And you have this awkward feeling of like, should I say something about, that? Like, or no, that would make me a sort of bad person, or I'm telling them that they're a bad person. I don't want to do that. So we're really interested in the way that people are actually always sort of moralizing. We're receiving moral example, we're giving it, and we're really interested in this question of when we have an awareness of our moral footprint, what happens, right? So one of the examples we talk about in the book is a friend of mine, Jo Walton, who's a wonderful science fiction writer. And she told us this story about going to a big science fiction convention by train in North America. She's from Wales, so trains are ordinary to her. And she has a policy of just taking trains when she's on a continent, including when the continent is North America. And she arrived at this...
Good luck.
Yeah. But it turns out it's possible. She arrived at this convention's big, lots of people there, and she was talking about taking the train. And they said, I didn't know a train came here. I think it was going to Albuquerque. Didn't know you could take a train here. And she said, I took a train from Montreal all the way here. It was wonderful. She talked about it. And everyone was sort of like, didn't even know trains existed. And she said that then 4 years later, there was another of these big conventions, and it was in North America. And it was her taking the train, and then 10 people who had been at the convention with her came on the train with her. So they took this kind of, it started in this way that maybe you could have seen that as like Jo being like, oh, you bad people who flew here. But instead, the form of moral example that she was giving, just of kind of moralizing, was actually to say, it's delightful to take the train. Would you like to join me with, do it? And they did. They had this like really beautiful 2-day train ride together that was this kind of like, moving party. So we're thinking about this as the difference between moralizing at someone, telling someone that they're doing something wrong, and moralizing with them.
Kind of inviting them into it.
Yeah.
And what I love about that as well is if your friend Jo was just thinking about it from a carbon footprint perspective, it would be, I'm one person, I've reduced my footprint. But actually, there's no way, you can tangibly measure how many people listened to what she said and then started a new habit. But I find that just so exciting that you can do something that to yourself might feel like it's just one small thing. But if it then ripples to many other people, your individual choice actually does matter, because it can have a huge impact, way more than you ever thought it could.
Exactly. It's really like we think about this as basically like being a moral example as a kind of raising morale, right? So much of the time when we look at like what we're doing around these complicated things, it can just feel like a real bummer, right? It can feel like I'm just going to tell people that, their meat eating or their, egg consumption is directly contributing to the mutations of the avian, the bird flu, and they are bad people and they should be, and there's just like lots of different ways to do this. Like that's a demoralizing thing, right? Like you're bad, your decisions are bad, don't do those things.
It's funny. I was going to say, like when, again, I still live a mostly vegan lifestyle, but when I was vegan, I remember sometimes on Twitter or, on Instagram, I would write certain things. I never felt morally superior, but I was more like, how can you not see the suffering you're causing? And, trying to approach it in that way. When I did my behavioral science degree, I was thinking, how do you change behavior? How do you motivate? It's interesting because actually just focusing on those positives like that it gives to you by just living aligned for your values, that is far more effective than giving them a hit list of here's 10 facts about why what you're doing is so awful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I love the connection you just made between moral and morale that I hadn't thought of before.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that we've been finding is that the word demoralizing came up in the Paris Commune, which was one of the autonomous collective practices that is like revolutionary context. And what people were really worried about who were fighting the Paris Commune, was that they were making the kind of working class, they were demoralizing them in the sense of degrading their morals. They were making them morally debased because they were interested in collective liberation, basically.
Almost like, shush, it's a dirty secret.
Yeah, exactly. So this quality of morale, right, of like this almost military thing is also about the kind of danger that getting lots of people together poses to the systems that actually produce the real harms.
Yeah.
So I think there's the part that's like the sort of like ceremonial and being a moral example. And then there's this sort of like, what happens if we're doing this? What happens if we are able to have conversations with people where we say, yes, we all feel implicated in horrifying things. What are the things that we can do together? Like how do we approach this? How do we work with this?
you talked earlier about how so much of the systems that are causing harm, it's due to almost like an imbalance of power, isn't it? Where a select few people have more wealth, more power, more ability to shape reality than everyone else. But what you're saying is, if more people as a mass, communicate and live well together and have the same shared goals and beliefs, that is far more powerful potentially.
Yeah. And so then it's that question of like, how do we do that? So how do we, if we say no individual can solve this, and yet all of these things are made by people, right? People did it. People made everything, and therefore we can transform it. I think it's really important for us to recognize that we're at a moment in history where people's capacity to work in horizontal, autonomous ways has been massively and successfully de-skilled. So almost no one now has real practice in working in groups that are not organized on fixed hierarchies. Most of us, our collective work is in a job where there's a boss, or a church where there's someone in charge, or right, there's even people who are sort of doing volunteer work. There's a board. They're often in a nonprofit. So one part of it is just to recognize, like, Alan Sears is a sociologist who talks about the neoliberal de-skilling of collectivity. So people really do feel it's accurate for people to say, I feel alone, like I don't know how to work with people. And you see people when they try sometimes get into these sort of very like bureaucratic, or sort of like fixed hierarchy approaches. So when we say like, take every site of complicity or implication as a site of traction for collective work, first, it's just to be very like kind of easy on ourselves about the fact that we might not actually know how to do that. And also that we're in a moment in history, like I talk often to people who were involved in radical movements in the 60s, and they say, look, you could have a collective house with one person having a job, part-time job, and it would pay the whole rent, and everyone else, their whole life could just be doing movement work, and that's not the case now. People are stretched and exhausted, and it's hard.
This is such a good point, honestly, because when we think about our individual responsibility here, because we're living at such a pivotal moment in time where there's all this, the meta crisis of different systems breaking and causing a lot of harm. But at the same time, many of us are working more hours. We have less of a village. I think for me, my awakening in some ways was when I went back to work full-time in big tech with no family support, with a young child. And how is this supposed to work? And, from an anthropological standpoint, it's not supposed to work. You're not supposed to have just two people. You're meant to have people around you. And I agree. I feel like that's such a real loss, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And then if you're supposed to sort of add things on top of just keeping everyone fed and minimally cared for, it can be really hard, especially if you're approaching it from a point of view that it's going to be a drag and annoying. And frequently, I have to say, like, doing movement work can be. You're often like in a room with people who are annoying or boring or, that's true. So moving toward collectivity, one of the things that I really believe and that I've seen is that when we start from the idea that we don't have to solve everything ourselves, but that we could work on something, then we can begin to ask, in the same way that we can say, what can I do with the self that I actually am in the situation that I actually am? Like, what are the choices I can make there?
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, like, if your child will not eat anything but those little packets, maybe that's not the hill you're going to fight on. But maybe there are things that you can do in the rest of your life that do feel like connecting you with, you're not eating the little packets, right? So it's like, you can be like, oh, I'm going to choose to not eat the adult equivalent of those little packets. And I have time and space and energy to, cook some broccoli, whatever. So in the same way, you can be asking, what are the things that I am actually connected to? So this place to start for getting traction for collectivity is not with an idea of like, what's the most important thing that anyone should be working on? I'm going to start working on that. It's to start with, where do you have a connection? And that can be a connection with other people, or it can be a connection with a particular system. So like, you are connected to tech. So it's asking, like, in this connection, what are the choices you can make? And where are the places that you can make options bigger for more choices to be made.
I love that, because it also makes me think of, don't know how much you know about Donella Meadows' work around systems.
Nothing.
And she has a concept of leverage point, and that if you can move the leverage point within the system, then it's just one tactical choice that you can make that then can shape completely profound, like, systemic transformation. And I love that idea that it's not about being perfect with every choice. It's about thinking, okay, where's the highest impact? Not trying to focus so much on, like, measuring impact, because I think that's a fool's errand. But yeah, thinking about what's yours to do based on where you have those connections. And just picking up from that point about connection, in your book, Against Purity, which I've been talking about a lot because I found it so useful, and you talk about our interconnectedness with other living beings, and the fact that we're not really truly separate individuals from a scientific, but also maybe the Buddhist aspect of that and some of the indigenous views of self. How does that idea that the self is an illusion, how might that help us with these, when we're grappling with these huge problems, I guess you might want to call them?
Yeah. So I think centering this idea of interdependence, or in disability studies, which is one of my core archives, we also just talk about dependence. So we just say, like, look, we're massively and beautifully dependent on one another. And the ideal of independence is not even something we want. And partially we don't want it because it's impossible, right? So we're part of a world that is incredibly generous. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass and a number of other wonderful books, really talks about this sense of, like, if you related to the world as just giving you incredible gifts with unbelievable generosity, you know, the sun, the air, the earth that grows things, you begin to have this feeling of the generosity is so overwhelming that it cannot be an exchange relation. Like, we are such dependent beings that we'd never be able to pay it back, right? And therefore, all we can offer is all we can offer. It's the same as, you know, parenting or caring for someone, right? Relations of total dependency are relations of, you know, in some ways, forced generosity, right? And I think socially, one of the things that we can start with often is just, who is not being cared for around me? And what would it mean to begin offering generosity genuinely, right?
And I think as well as that, recognizing the importance of care from my context of being, you know, a mum, and I've learned how so much of, like, unpaid labor, which is typically in the feminine domain, but when our society also prioritizes paid labor, when actually labor is not potentially the best word for care, but it is in a sense that it's the necessary work that has to happen in order for the capitalist economy to survive as well. It's not valued at all by the system.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's been really beautiful work. There's a new book that's coming out about a social movement that called Wages for Housework, that was really making the point that if capitalism paid the people that it depends on to reproduce the workforce, the whole thing would grind to a halt. So if the kind of work that is necessary, both for future generations of workers to exist and just for the person to be replenished enough to go back to their job the next day, right? So this is doing the laundry, doing the feeding, but it's also doing the, like, how was your day today?
Yeah, and the actual sort of relational type of labor. Again, it is necessary.
It's necessary labor, yeah. And I think there's some really abstruse and complicated pitched battles about the question of whether social reproduction work actually produces value, or if it just produces the conditions under which things can get bought and sold, which is how we track. I mean, it's, as you're saying, right? Like, where and how do we track anything? Like, when do we make things countable, basically? And it's very hard to make countable being a caring partner or being a good parent. So in my work, what I'm interested in is, how do we make fewer and fewer things countable, right? Like,
almost as if it's like a transaction.
So we want to, you know, there was a tendency for a little while for people to be like, don't come and talk to me about your problems, that's for your therapist. And then a sort of counter response that really was like, no, actually, everyone needs to have friends and people who care for them, who think about, you know, are interested in how they are and want to have supportive conversations about emotional stuff that they're going through. This isn't just a realm that needs to be monetized. People should have good therapy if they want it, but we also just can be caring with each other.
Yeah, we don't have to make everything into some kind of extractive exchange. When we think about the work that you're doing, when you're looking at, for example, Ursula K. Le Guin's science fiction, and how fiction is about also imagining new alternatives, because when you're talking about this world where, you know, everyone gets the care they need, and it does sound so utopian, but it doesn't have to be, does it? It could be a potential future that actually could exist. So maybe we can chat a bit about how what you're learning from that work there, and how that has implications for a world that we could potentially collectively build.
Yeah. So, and this comes back to this question of leverage points, I think. So, because I think one of the things that we want to think about when we're making steps toward collectivity is this idea of starting from where we are and building connections, building horizontal relations of political movement, is this idea that anywhere we are, we don't have to identify the ideal leverage point. Anywhere we are can become a leverage point for changing the system. So ultimately, like, we really do need to skill up in the capacity to work together. And that can mean that people are starting from a concern with, in this community, we're having a certain number of refugees come and settle, and there's been tremendous racism against them, and this concerns me. How am I going to get people together to address this? Well, maybe we actually are starting from making sure that the people who are coming have, in Ottawa, really need good winter clothes. Or, you know, I'm very concerned about this proposal to build a new jail on this wetland, right? So starting with those things, the only way that anything is going to actually change is through working together with others. So I'm a big fan of people forming collectives, forming political organizations, becoming part of massive, like, what we need actually is social movements of hundreds of millions of people, but all doing
people
different
together, because Yeah, because I think we fall into the trap, don't we, of potentially, we read about these social issues, we read about justice, we take workshops, for example. I came across one of your talks on whiteness and how white people often get stuck into this idea of they feel bad, but they just keep learning. They feel bad, they keep learning, and they don't actually change anything.
Yeah, just to pair that with the question about Le Guin. So I think that really one of the things that reading, I think this can happen from reading history. I think it can happen from reading some mimetic fiction, but science fiction actually is a way that when we're trying to imagine, how would I do something, right? What is a way that things could be otherwise? There's a tremendous amount of science fiction that is based on the idea that things are just going to continue and get worse and worse and worse in the exact same ways that they are now. So finding science fictional imaginings of worlds in which people got together and made things otherwise can be a way, especially when we haven't had that personal experience. Reading novels actually is a way that you feel as though you were there, right? It allows you to imagine something that you haven't experienced. And I think, again, Jo Walton, the science fiction writer friend, one of the things that she says often about science fiction is that it's not that it's helping us practice for the future that will come. It's helping us practice to be surprised by the future, to generate a future that was not predicted by the current situation. And we really need that, because if we just continue the way that we're going and we think that the way things are the way that things are going to be, we're not going to have this felt sense that we could have a different world.
Yeah, I guess we almost would feel defeated, wouldn't we? That we can't change things. It's just going to keep getting dystopian and worse.
Exactly.
I have no power. And that's why I love this idea about how imagination and fiction, and this is coming from someone, by the way, I barely read any fiction at the moment. I'm just absorbing nonfiction. Yeah. But clearly fiction is actually a portal to how to live differently.
It's very helpful. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, one of the books that I really love and I really recommend is Ruth Anna Emrys has a book called A Half-Built Garden, which is, some people characterize it as hope punk.
I've not heard of that. Is that like related to solar punk?
Like solar punk, yeah. In this book, A Half-Built Garden, the protagonists it's a first contact story. Aliens come to Earth. And it's a near future where corporations still exist and nation states still exist. But the main political power are watershed monitoring care committees. And there's someone who's awake because the baby's crying, and there's a environmental sensor goes off, and they need to go check out what's happening in this nearby stream that's part of their care catchment. And so the first contact with these aliens is with these two women and a crying baby. And it's a fundamentally different first contact story that also is doing super interesting things about ecology and environmentalism. So I recommend it to you. I guess I could say just about Le Guin, right? So
Yeah,
Le Guin
please.
also has this really fascinating book called The Dispossessed, which is her most anarchist book. It's a book about an anarchist moon and the question of societal transformation. It's really fascinating.
So we talked a little bit about like collective responsibility, but what I would love to maybe dig into in the last few minutes is discussing this idea of many of us are starting to recognize far more with this idea of unearned privilege. There's this potential trap of guilt as well. And based on the work that you've done, and how do you kind of flip that into, I think you used the phrase being a traitor to whiteness, is actually about looking at this is a social construct that I've benefited from. And then how do we become a traitor to something like that?
Yeah, that's a great thing for us to end on. So I have found it really useful for us to recognize that when we have these bad feelings about how we're beneficiaries of horror, we're implicated in histories that we don't want and in present situations that we wish were otherwise, that guilt is not the right feeling. It's not the right name for that feeling, because most of the time we aren't personally imprisoning someone in a concentration camp because they're an undocumented refugee who's been driven out of their home by climate change. Like, we didn't personally do that. It's not like we took someone's special thing and smashed it, right? When we take someone's special thing and smash it, we should feel guilty about that. That was a bad thing. I think the feeling that we have about being implicated in horror is more shame, actually. So it's a feeling of, I don't want to be this person. I don't want to live in a world in which this is who I am. But it's this, and usually shame is something that we should just reject. Like we should not feel ashamed of our bodies or our desires but in this case, feeling shame about being situated in racial capitalism in a certain way, right, is not a bad thing. It's not something that I ever think we should try to shame other people about. Like, you should feel bad. No. At all. It's that when we feel it, we can say, this feeling is part of my commitment to wanting the world to be otherwise. Mm-hmm. So it's again this toggling back and forth between the individual response and the question of like, what's actually effective? Like and we know that collectivity, that because it's a lie that anyone is an individual, it's a lie that anyone can solve things personally, but we can take things personally and do things together. So taking that feeling, that bad feeling, and turning towards...
It's like transforming it.
Yeah, what else? How would we change the world then, right? How would we work with other people? So for these particular systems, when we're implicated in evil, right? And here I take this definition of evil from a philosopher, Claudia Card, who says we are implicated in evil when the actions that are taking place are going to definitely cause unbearable harm. And many of us are, right, implicated in these things, that it is unbearable, it is harmful, and we're involved. So then we say, where do I have standing to make any intervention there? And the model of treason comes from a white anti-racist Mab Segrist who worked all her life for civil rights and against racism. And in the U.S. South, where she grew up, she was often named a race traitor because she was saying that she thought whiteness should not be the operating system. So there's a certain way that, we want to become treasonous to the things that we oppose. And those are the things that we're closest to often.
I love this. So if I kind of summarize what we've discussed, it feels like we're rejecting this idea that an individual is responsible for all of the harms they cause. But that being said, they can still take their awareness of their complicity and use it to find out their leverage points. But ultimately, what I've taken from this conversation is lovely. It's this idea that we need to get out of our own ways, stop focusing on our individualistic carbon footprints, and it's about moving towards that more collective, finding people who you can work with, and ultimately this idea of care as well, which I think we should be talking about far more.
Yeah, it's a kind of imperfectionism, right? So it's an imperfectionist
I love that.
ethic. Yeah, that really is, since we're never going to be able to be perfect, we can do what we can do, and then we can make the scope, we can build our capacity for doing. And in this moment right now, I think the other thing I would really emphasize is that we actually do need to practice resisting evil. It's not something that just happens, right? And we do it in the small ways, right? Like, we're not going to be able to fundamentally transform racist immigration policy if we're too terrified to tell someone that thing that they said or this policy that's happening at work is racist.
Exactly. So, it starts at the small scale.
Yeah. And that's that part where we don't solve anything by ourselves, but nothing happens if we don't do things. So we should do more things together.
Oh, Alexis, thank you so much. That was a lovely way to end the conversation. So yeah, thank you for being here.
Yes, such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to the rest of the podcast.
Thank you.